Sir Charles Trevelyan stood by the heavy window of his office, watching the grey light of early January 1862 struggle to penetrate the fog. The wind coming off the Thames estuary was not merely cold, it was biting. It carried a sharp salt edge that seemed to rattle the very glass in its frames. Below him, the river did not look like water. It looked like a moving wall of liquid iron, heavy and dark, pressing itself against the stone foundations of the Palace of Westminster. The reports began to arrive in small, frantic increments. A messenger arrived with a note stating that the embankments near Westminster Bridge were no longer holding. The water was not just rising, it was searching for a way in. Trevelyan could hear it even from his height. It was a rhythmic, dull thudding, the sound of the tide hitting the massive masonry of the river wall. It sounded less like a river and more like a siege engine striking a gate. He watched a group of river police struggling near the waterline, their lanterns flickering like dying stars against the rising swell. The Thames was behaving with a strange, violent energy. It was as if the river had grown tired of its banks and was determined to reclaim the land. As the tide climbed higher, the stone steps of the embankment vanished entirely. The river was no longer contained. It was an intruder, and it was knocking on the doors of the empire. The transition from a river problem to a government problem happened with a quiet, sickening dampness. By mid-morning, the chill in the air had turned into a pervasive, heavy moisture that clung to the velvet curtains and the oak panelling of the corridors. Trevelyan walked toward the House of Commons, but he stopped short at the threshold. The smell hit him first. It was the unmistakable scent of the river, a thick, cloying odour of river silt, rotting vegetation, and ancient, disturbed mud. He looked down at the floorboards. In the lower corridors, the wood was dark and weeping. Small, shallow pools of brackish water had begun to seep upward through the cracks in the flooring, as if the very earth beneath the palace had become saturated. It was a slow, inexorable intrusion. The water was not rushing in like a broken dam, but it was rising like a ghost through the foundations. The atmosphere in the halls was one of mounting, frantic realization. Clerks were moving quickly, their faces pale, carrying stacks of parchment away from the damp walls. There was a growing consensus among the officials that the lower chambers were becoming unworkable. You could not debate the future of the nation while standing in a shallow pool of Thames mud. The dignity of the house was being dissolved by the very river that London relied upon for its life. To understand the chaos, Trevelyan knew he had to look back to the weeks prior. The winter had begun with a cruelty that felt personal. In late December, the temperature had plummeted to levels that seemed impossible for a city of this size. The frost was brutal. It was a deep, crystalline freeze that turned the city into a landscape of white and grey. He remembered the reports from the river pilots. The Thames had not just frozen, it had jammed. Massive sheets of ice had drifted down from the upper reaches and become wedged near London Bridge, creating a chaotic, frozen barricade of slush and solid ice. For days, the river had been a silent, motionless graveyard of white. Then, the shift happened. It was as sudden as the freeze had been. A strange, warm wind began to blow from the south, a wind that felt unnaturally soft against the skin. It was the kind of warmth that felt deceptive. This sudden, violent thaw began to act upon the ice with catastrophic force. The massive sheets of frozen river began to break apart, turning into a churning, heavy slurry. This melt did not just flow, it surged. The river was no longer a solid mass, but a pressurized engine of water and ice, all rushing toward the banks at once. The pressure behind the river walls near Westminster became more than the stone could bear. Trevelyan stood near the edge of the embankment, watching the grey water churn with a heavy, rhythmic violence. The defences were designed for seasonal rises, not for the sudden liquid weight of a melting glacier. A sound like a distant cannon shot echoed across the water, followed by a sickening groan of masonry. A section of the embankment wall gave way. The river did not merely rise, it burst through the gap in a thick brown surge. The river police scrambled toward the breach, their heavy coats soaked through by the spray. They attempted to divert the flow with makeshift barriers and sandbags, but the surge was too immense. Every time they tried to stem the tide, the sheer force of the slurry pushed them back. It was a losing battle against a river that had lost its composure. The water carried with it everything the Thames had collected during the freeze. Massive chunks of ice, tangled river weeds, and thick layers of silt rushed into the streets. Trevelyan watched as the drainage pipes, meant to carry away the city's runoff, became useless. They were instantly clogged by the debris. Instead of draining the streets, the pipes began to back up, vomiting mud and freezing slush back onto the cobblestones. The political district was no longer a place of order. It was becoming a floodplain. The muddy water crept steadily toward the foundations of the Palace of Westminster, hungry and relentless. The very ground beneath the seat of government was turning into a saturated, unstable marsh. The transition from a nuisance to a crisis happened in the span of a single hour. Trevelyan entered the central lobby and found the floor already slick with a thin, creeping film of river water. The dampness was not a mist. It was a physical presence that smelled of salt and old mud. In the corridors, the dignity of the British government was dissolving into a frantic, uncoordinated scramble. Members of Parliament moved with a sense of bewildered urgency, lifting their heavy mahogany desks and trying to shove them onto higher stone plinths. The chaos was most visible in the record office. The clerks, men who usually moved with a quiet, methodical precision, were now stumbling through the rising sludge. They worked with trembling hands, trying to stack ledgers and parchment atop anything that remained dry. Papers drifted like pale ghosts across the flooded floor, caught in the small eddies created by the heavy furniture. The atmosphere shifted from confusion to genuine alarm when the Speaker of the House appeared at the threshold of the chamber. His face was pale, his usual composure replaced by a grim necessity. He did not call for a vote or a debate. Instead, he issued a command that felt surreal for a place of such gravity. He ordered an emergency evacuation of the chamber. The legislative heart of the empire was being abandoned to the tide. There was no ceremony in the exit, only the heavy splashing of boots in the rising water and the frantic, hushed whispers of men realizing that their sanctuary was no longer safe. The evacuation turned into a desperate migration. The Palace of Westminster had become a labyrinth of rising water and thick, ankle-deep sludge. Trevelyan watched as the process of salvaging the state began. The most urgent priority was the Hansard records. These volumes, the very written memory of every law and debate, were being hauled out in heavy, waterlogged crates. Men carried them through the halls like precious relics, their movements hurried and heavy. The scene was one of profound indignity. Dignitaries, men who were accustomed to the finest silks and most polished floors, were forced to wade through the filth. Trevelyan saw a group of officials struggling through a layer of silt that had turned the grand hallways into a swamp. Their trousers were stained dark, and their expressions were a mixture of anger and embarrassment. Even the ceremonial items, the symbols of parliamentary continuity, were being moved with frantic care to prevent them from being lost to the mud. The goal was simple but difficult. They needed to find a dry location, any location, where the business of the nation could continue. The scramble moved away from the river, pushing up the hill toward higher ground. It was a disorganized procession of men, paper, and wood, leaving behind the grand, flooded halls of the palace. As Trevelyan followed the crowd, he looked back at the retreating silhouette of the Westminster buildings. They looked less like a seat of power and more like a sinking vessel, struggling to stay afloat in a rising, muddy sea. The makeshift chamber sat several hundred feet above the river, a draughty hall that lacked the soaring arches and gilded dignity of the Palace of Westminster. Trevelyan watched as men who usually sat upon velvet cushions now squeezed onto hard wooden benches that had been dragged up from local storage. The air in the room was thick and smelled of wet wool and coal smoke. There was no grand acoustics here. Instead, every cough and every rustle of a parchment document seemed to bounce sharply off the damp, unadorned walls. The transition from the seat of empire to this cramped space felt like a profound humiliation. Trevelyan observed a member of Parliament attempting to read a bill, but the man kept shifting his weight, clearly uncomfortable on the narrow seat. The traditional grandeur of the house was gone. There were no heavy oak desks to anchor the debate, only a collection of mismatched tables and a sense of hurried desperation. Even the lighting felt insufficient, as the flickering lamps struggled against the gloom of the high, shadowed ceiling. The debates continued, but the atmosphere was stripped of its usual ritual. Without the familiar surroundings, the politicians seemed smaller, more human, and infinitely more frazzled. They spoke of national policy and imperial trade, yet their eyes frequently darted toward the windows, as if checking for more rain. Trevelyan noted that the very rhythm of the law had changed. The pauses were shorter, the voices more strained. The business of the nation was being conducted in a room that felt less like a temple of democracy and more like a temporary shelter for survivors of a shipwreck. The silence of the flooded palace was broken only by the rhythmic dripping of water from the vaulted ceilings. Trevelyan walked alongside a group of engineers who moved through the lower levels with heavy, brass-bound lanterns. Their boots made wet, sucking sounds against the floor. They were not looking at the art or the architecture, but at the cracks in the stone and the depth of the sludge. The damage was more invasive than anyone had initially feared. As they descended toward the legislative vaults, the engineers pointed out thick layers of river silt that had been forced deep into the crevices of the masonry. It was a fine grey mud that had settled into the very foundations of the law. One engineer, a man named Mr. Arkwright, knelt to examine a section of the floor where the Victorian plumbing had buckled under the pressure of the surge. The intricate network of pipes, once a marvel of modern engineering, now sat shattered and choked with debris. Trevelyan watched as they recorded their findings in small, leather-bound ledgers. The reports were grim. The heating systems were ruined, and the structural integrity of the lower chambers was in question. When the engineers began to discuss the initial cost estimates, the numbers were staggering. They spoke of thousands of pounds required just to clear the silt and stabilize the walls. These figures would soon be sent to the Treasury, but for now, the engineers simply stood in the dark, looking at the ruin of the Empire's most important building. Back in the temporary assembly, the mood had shifted from embarrassment to a strange, focused urgency. The very disaster that had displaced them was now the primary subject of the afternoon session. The politicians were no longer debating the nuances of colonial taxation or maritime law. Instead, they were arguing over the reinforcement of the Thames embankment. Trevelyan listened to the debates from the periphery. The tension in the room was palpable, caught between the immediate necessity of safety and the growing dread of the mounting costs. Some members argued that the Treasury could not possibly absorb the expense of rebuilding the river walls to such a massive scale. They spoke of fiscal responsibility and the danger of setting a precedent for endless public works. Yet, a peculiar thing was happening in the hall. The fierce partisan divides that usually defined the House seemed to soften. The Whigs and the Tories, men who rarely agreed on a single clause of a bill, found themselves nodding in unison when the threat of the next tide was mentioned. The river did not care about political affiliation, and the politicians were beginning to realize that the Thames was a more powerful legislator than any man in the room. They worked through the evening, drafting emergency measures to fund the repairs. It was an unlikely unity, born not of shared ideology, but of a shared, muddy reality. The flood had forced them into a singular, desperate purpose. The water did not leave all at once. It retreated in slow, rhythmic gasps, leaving behind a heavy, saline scent that clung to the velvet curtains and the oak panelling. Trevelyan stood in the central lobby, watching the workmen scrub at the water lines. The stone floors of the Palace of Westminster were finally drying, but they remained stained with a dark, silted residue. It was a map of the river's progress, a permanent record etched into the very bones of the building. The transition back to normalcy felt strangely hollow. As the members of Parliament returned to their permanent benches, the familiar roar of debate resumed, but the atmosphere had shifted. The grandiosity of the chamber felt thinner, more fragile. Men sat in the same high-backed chairs where they had argued for decades. Yet they all carried the quiet knowledge that the floor beneath them was merely a crust over a sleeping giant. Trevelyan walked toward the tall windows that overlooked the Thames. The river was calm now, looking deceptively peaceful under the pale January sun. The embankment walls were scarred and patched with fresh masonry, looking like a soldier with a poorly healed wound. He remembered the sight of the muddy surge breaching the defences, a force that had rendered every law and every budget meaningless in a single afternoon. The Parliament had survived, and the business of the Empire would continue. But the illusion of total control had vanished. They had legislated the flood, but they had not conquered the river. As Trevelyan watched a barge drift slowly past the window, he realized that the Thames had not just entered their halls. It had left a memory in the stone, a reminder that even the highest seat of power is ultimately subject to the tide.